Hey guys, tonight we begin with a subject that's both eyebrow-raising and oddly educational intimacy in medieval Europe. Not the candlelit harp music damsel sighing sort of intimacy, you can leave that to fantasy novels. We're talking about the straw-poked, goat-adjacent please don't wake the babies version. You'll hear the chickens before the flirting even begins. You may have imagined medieval lovers slipping into four-poster beds behind velvet curtains. In reality, your sleeping quarters are a single-room cottage you share with your parents, your in-laws, a few children, one grumpy pig, and a chicken who somehow always locks eyes with you at the worst possible moment. Privacy isn't just a luxury, it's an architectural impossibility. Even the idea of bedrooms didn't really exist for most people. If your home has 4 walls, a roof, and 1 central fire pit, congratulations, you're doing better than average. The bed, if you're lucky enough to have one, is stuffed with straw that smells like mildew and disappointment. Sheets are rare. Blankets are often shared. And if you're a peasant, which statistically you are, your in-laws might be snoring 3 feet away while you contemplate romance beneath a squeaky thatch roof. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it right now? I love seeing who's joining us around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You tug the rough linen sheet over your shoulder. It's barely wide enough for 2, but warmth trumps modesty when the wind blows through the shutters. Your partner lies beside you, both of you painfully aware of the sleeping forms on the other side of the room. One of them just coughed. You pause. Wait. Silence. Okay, back to business, if you can call it that. Historians still argue whether peasant homes had intentional sleeping zones, or whether people simply passed out wherever was warmest. What's clear is that intimacy was rarely private. Children, elders, and visiting relatives all bunked together. Some families owned curtains to drape around the bed if they were doing well. Most didn't. If you wanted alone time, your best bet was to send the kids to fetch water and hope the dog didn't decide to join you on the mattress. Even noble families didn't fare much better. While they lived in stone halls with more rooms, those rooms were often filled with servants, advisors, guards, and visiting cousins. A lord might have a feather-stuffed bed and silk covers, but that didn't stop 2 pages and a steward from snoozing on a bench across the chamber. And they weren't exactly discreet. One noblewoman complained in her letters that she couldn't enjoy her marriage bed without the eyes of the household haunting her like saints. That's a poetic way of saying people were always around. Always. Even travelers weren't spared. Inns were scarce, and the ones that existed rented out beds, not rooms. You might find yourself squeezed between a snoring tanner and a chatty merchant, wondering if the rustling under the covers next to you was an affectionate goodbye or a flea colony uprising. Let's not forget the sensory backdrop to all this sweat, soot, smoke, and livestock. Romance, when it happened, bloomed in the cracks between exhaustion and ambient barnyard scent. Still, somehow it did bloom. Mainstream histories often skip over this side of medieval life, too messy, too unglamorous. But the mundane, the awkward, and the absurd are where real people lived. And when you're curled up on scratchy straw with your knees tucked to avoid a mouse hole, that realness matters. Because love, even when shared next to a bucket of turnips, still counts. You shift beneath the thin wool blanket, and across the room someone stirs. A cough, a snore, then silence again. Timing, you realize, is everything. You reach for your partner, but pause. Was that the goat moving? No. Just the wind rattling the shutters. In the medieval world, getting intimate wasn't just about desire, it was about logistics. How much time do you have before the neighbor barges in to borrow a jug? Are the children asleep, and more importantly, are they facing the wall? These were the real romance questions of the time. Creative timing became a skill passed down between couples. Maybe you rise early before the rooster's solo performance begins. Or perhaps you wait until everyone else is out in the fields, tending barley or chasing a runaway pig. Even then, interruptions loomed. Chickens were known to wander indoors. Dogs rarely respected boundaries. And of course, those ever-curious relatives had a sixth sense for when you wanted to be alone. Historians still debate how much consideration was given to privacy in peasant homes. Was it purposeful or purely circumstantial? But we know this discretion was everything. Intimacy wasn't just a private act. It was a village event waiting to happen if you weren't careful. Some couples relied on coded phrases. "Shall we check the straw?" might be all it took to convey the intention without alerting the ears of grandma knitting beside the fire. Others employed bribes. "Go pick apples," you'd say to a sibling, slipping them an extra heel of rye bread for their silence. Among the lower classes, it wasn't uncommon for intimate moments to be stolen in barns, granaries, or forest clearings. These makeshift escapes had their own hazards. Splinters, cold weather, and occasionally a disapproving owl. But for many, they were preferable to the scrutiny of a shared home. Even upper-class couples surrounded by attendants faced similar obstacles. A noblewoman might ask her maid to fetch the lavender oil as a signal to clear the room for a few brief moments. Meanwhile, the nobleman is trying to pretend the herald, announcing the next banquet isn't standing awkwardly in the corner, waiting to report the goose shortage. And when creative timing failed, well, you learned to ignore the background commentary. One 14th century poem alludes to lovers being joined in rhythm with the creaking beams and distant bells. It's a strangely poetic way of saying, yes, intimacy happened while the church bells were tolling and the roof threatened collapse. Then there were the holidays. You might think feast days and festivals were romantic, but intimacy during major church festivals was strictly frowned upon. Which meant, ironically, that the days people were most likely to be drunk and merry were the same days they were supposed to keep their hands to themselves. One fringe account from a French parish notes that couples would use song lyrics as timing devices. A lullaby sung to a toddler might also be a countdown when the song ends, the child's asleep, and the window of opportunity begins. Modern couples worry about syncing schedules. Medieval couples worried about syncing it with a moment when no one was milking the goat in the corner. It's easy to laugh now, but these constraints shaped the way people related to each other. Intimacy became strategic, less spontaneous passion, and more careful choreography. In some ways that made every moment more meaningful. When the entire world seems to be conspiring against your privacy, a quiet moment under a thin blanket starts to feel sacred. And sure, the conditions were absurd. The smells, the sounds, the sheer number of onlookers, both human and animal. But medieval couples adapted. They had to, because love and desire as always find a way even when the kids are pretending to sleep and the cow is watching. The straw mattress beneath you shifts as someone rolls over not your partner, but your cousin asleep at your feet. You freeze. Then relax as his snoring resumes steady and oblivious. You glance at your partner beside you. There's a moment of wordless understanding. You both know you have about 6 minutes before someone else wakes up or starts yelling about spilled porridge. Time is precious and fleeting. In the medieval world, beds were rarely private, rarely quiet, and almost never exclusive. Even the term bed is misleading. For most people, it meant a sagging bundle of straw, perhaps laid over wooden slats if you were lucky. If not, the floor sufficed, usually with a fur or coarse blanket as your only insulation from the cold earth. And these beds shared. Always shared. A peasant household might have one bed for all the children and one for the parents, although even that was a luxury. Extended family visitors and sometimes even paying lodgers were folded into the sleeping arrangement like human luggage. You didn't just share a bed with your spouse. You shared it with anyone the house couldn't fit elsewhere. This was less romantic weekend getaway and more snoring symphony of the generational kind. Among the upper classes, the bed looked more impressive. Canopy frames, feather-stuffed mattresses, ornate embroidery. But the rules weren't all that different. Servants often slept at the foot of the master's bed, either on narrow benches or bundled into spare cloaks. Some were assigned to tend fires or guard valuables, but mostly they were just always there. Watching, pretending not to. One noble's household record from the 13th century even lists blanket rotation where 3 attendants slept in 6-hour shifts, replacing one another beside the hearth, as though intimacy itself were a military post. Historians still argue whether this arrangement was intended for efficiency or control, but either way it didn't leave much room for passion. And if the couple did manage to steal a moment of closeness, there were consequences to navigate. Whisper too loudly, and it might be tomorrow's gossip at the market. Rustle the bed curtains too vigorously, and you'd wake up to a chambermaid trying not to laugh while refilling your wash basin. It wasn't just the number of people, it was the design. Medieval architecture wasn't built with privacy in mind. Stone walls echoed. Floorboards creaked. Thick doors were rare, and even when present, they weren't much of a barrier. Sound carried, and everyone was listening, if not intentionally, then because there was literally no way not to. Still, people tried. Beds were arranged in corners away from doors. Thick tapestries or hanging cloth offered some illusion of separation, even if they smelled of damp wool and last week's stew. Couples developed a finely tuned awareness of when others were in deep sleep and when they were just pretending. Children were trained early to look away, to stay quiet, to understand without understanding. One fringe record even suggests that some families had sleep songs, low rhythmic chants sung by an older family member, to signal bedtime offering cover noise for whatever else might be occurring in the darkness. Whether that's charming or mildly disturbing depends on your modern sensibilities. Yet within all this chaos, people still found connection. Emotional intimacy grew from necessity. When you sleep shoulder to shoulder with 6 people sharing warmth, breath, and secrets whispered in the dark, a strange closeness develops. You know who twitches in their sleep, who dreams aloud, who wakes at the slightest sound of a dog barking in the distance. You also learn to treasure the smallest luxuries, a moment alone, a glance, a brush of hands under the blanket, a night when it's just the 2 of you and no one else wakes up coughing. In a world that made privacy nearly impossible, affection wasn't less, it was more intentional. So the next time you adjust your duvet in a quiet bedroom with a locked door and blackout curtains, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. They had straw in their hair, relatives in their bed, and a chicken pecking at the foot of the mattress, and somehow they still managed to fall in love. The road is muddy, you're tired, and the inn you finally reach smells faintly of damp bread sweat and something you're too afraid to identify. But at least there's a roof and a bed. You just weren't expecting to share it with 2 strangers, one of whom is already snoring and wearing his boots. Traveling in the medieval world came with an entirely different set of expectations about sleep space and, well, personal boundaries. If you were a peasant on foot, a tradesperson on the move, or even a knight between battles, the likelihood of having a bed to yourself was slim to non-existent. Most inns were communal. Think of them as medieval hostels, but without check-in desks, privacy curtains, or pleasant background jazz. You paid for a space on a bed or a mattress on the floor, or sometimes just a warm corner near the fireplace. The innkeeper would cram as many bodies into one room as the floorboards could tolerate. In a busy town during festival season, that could mean 10 people in one room, 4 to a bed, and someone in the corner arguing with the goat. Historians still debate whether innkeepers truly allowed such crowding, or if this reputation was exaggerated by moralist chroniclers. But numerous travel accounts confirm that bed sharing among strangers was routine. In fact, it wasn't considered scandalous, just cozy. Uncomfortably cozy. So imagine you crawl into bed after a long, cold ride, hoping for rest, and immediately realize the man next to you is clutching a dagger, even in his sleep. The other guest smells like pickled herring and mutters to himself about taxes. You lie very, very still, unsure whether to face them or the wall, and suddenly nostalgic for the comfort of a straw-filled bed, shared with 5 relatives and a judgmental chicken. Some inn beds had partitions, a sort of crude divider to offer the illusion of privacy. Others just offered blankets and a firm rule no funny business. That didn't always stop people, of course. There are accounts, one from a traveling merchant in 1297, of 2 guests waking up mid-intimacy to discover they had company. The company had opinions. One fringe law from a Flemish town required innkeepers to post a mark above each bed, naming its rightful tenants. The intention was noble reduce disputes and prevent strangers from climbing into the wrong bunk. In practice, the signs were ignored or fell down or became the butt of local jokes. Among nobles, travel was more luxurious, but not necessarily more private. Caravans included servants, guards, clerks, and food testers. Stopping at castles or monasteries meant sleeping in guest halls where chambers were shared and walls were thin. A noble couple might share a bed curtained in velvet, but still hear the stablemaster arguing outside about who forgot to feed the oxen. Sometimes intimacy on the road was simply impractical. Exhaustion trumped desire. Armor didn't come off easily, and let's not even talk about chamber pot proximity. Yet even in these cramped conditions, people managed to connect. A glance exchanged over candlelight, a shared blanket, a whispered conversation while others pretended to be asleep. The same rhythms of closeness emerged just with the added challenge of someone accidentally elbowing you in the ribs at 3 a.m. What's fascinating is how normalized all this was. The medieval mindset didn't equate bed sharing with intimacy. Bodies were stacked for warmth convenience, or simply because there was no alternative. Intimacy required something else: trust, secrecy, deliberate choice. That said, if you were hoping to woo someone during your travels, you had to get creative. Maybe a coded note passed under a tankard. Maybe an invitation to inspect the stables at dawn. One innkeeper's record from York lists broken latch on room 3 as a recurring issue. Historians suspect it wasn't just poor craftsmanship. Travel in the Middle Ages wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, but it was deeply human. Dirty, unpredictable, occasionally hilarious, and always communal. So next time you're scrolling for the perfect hotel room, with blackout curtains and Egyptian cotton sheets, picture this: 3 snoring strangers, 1 angry goat, and you trying to sleep in chainmail. The embers in the hearth are low now, casting long flickering shadows across the stone floor. You roll over gently and come face to face, not with your beloved, but with Thomas the household page, who's neatly curled up on a wool mat at the foot of the bed. He doesn't stir. You sigh and shift again, careful not to knock over the basin of lavender water on the bedside table. Another night with an audience. If you thought noble status guaranteed privacy, think again. In fact, the wealthier you were, the more likely it was that someone, usually several someones, was present during even your most intimate moments. Welcome to the world of medieval household staff, where being wealthy meant being constantly observed by people paid to pretend they weren't watching. The idea of a private chamber was more fantasy than reality. A noble woman might have her own solar, a semi-private room used for writing letters or escaping chaos, but sleeping quarters were often communal. And a noble couple's bed wasn't just a place for rest, it was a literal stage for public and ceremonial life. Important guests were received there. Political alliances were discussed, and yes, the consummation of a marriage might be witnessed by attendants just to ensure legitimacy. Nothing says romance like polite clapping after your first night together. Historians still argue whether these witnesses actually watched the act, or simply confirm that both parties entered the bedchamber and emerged looking generally disheveled. Either way, privacy was optional. Performance, on the other hand, was expected. Even on normal nights, nobles rarely slept alone. Servants were assigned to remain nearby at all hours. Some to tend the fire, others to fetch items as needed, and at least one to ensure their lord or lady didn't wake up thirsty or attacked by a midnight assassin. The latter was probably more common in court gossip than real life, but it justified the shadowy figure hovering in the corner with a candle and an overdeveloped sense of duty. One fringe source, an Italian domestic ledger from 1374, includes a note: Margaret prefers the boy to hum hymns if she wakes at night. That's one way to lull yourself back to sleep after being startled awake mid-dream by your husband sneezing into his velvet sleeve. And then there were the pets. A lapdog curled at your feet wasn't just decoration, it was warmth, security, and in a pinch a deterrent to unwanted midnight visits. But it also meant more eyes, more ears, and the occasional paw to the face during a moment of closeness. Add to this the physical layout of noble homes. Most rooms opened into one another. Doors were rare and locks rarer still. Even the most elite spaces had multiple access points. Servants could appear through side corridors, trapdoors, or hidden staircases, used to deliver warm water and cold gossip. Nobles learned to adapt. If you were clever, you scheduled alone time during moments when your staff was distracted, say during Mass, or while everyone was busy preparing for a feast. Some couples developed unspoken codes. A certain candle lit in the window meant, "Please leave us be." A certain book left open meant, "Do not disturb unless someone's on fire." Yet even with all this maneuvering, intimacy remained a delicate dance. Imagine trying to express affection while a sleepy valet snoozes 10 feet away with his mouth open, or a maid silently folds laundry in the corner pretending her ears don't work. One noblewoman's diary fragment from the 15th century confesses, "I feigned illness thrice this month for solitude. The servants suspected nothing. Or perhaps they did and let me have it anyway." A rare glimpse of how even those with status still had to beg borrow or fake a fever just to be alone. Strangely, this constant presence didn't always ruin closeness. In some households, the quiet routine of servants became part of the rhythm background figures in the theater of domestic life. Over time, nobles and their attendants developed a kind of mutual discretion pact. I won't ask what you overheard, and you won't repeat it unless it's funny. Of course not. Everyone was so forgiving, some noblemen enforced strict rules about who could be present and when. Others demanded that servants keep to adjoining rooms unless summoned. But those were exceptions, not norms. For most staff, proximity was as inevitable as drafty windows and the scent of tallow candles. So if you find yourself grumbling about roommates or house guests overstaying their welcome, remember your medieval counterpart had to plan romantic encounters around footmen, firewood carriers, and the occasional bard loitering by the hallway. And still, somehow, they made it work. You're resting under a wool blanket in a room that smells faintly of candle wax ale and rosemary because it's a holy day, and that means no touching. Not even a kiss on the forehead. Not even a suggestive glance if the priest is nearby. You sigh. Tomorrow's out too. It's a saint's feast, and Wednesday technically suspicious. If medieval intimacy had one great antagonist, it wasn't gossip or goats, it was the church. Not just the institution, but the massive, omnipresent structure of belief rules and regulation that wrapped itself around daily life like a particularly heavy cloak. You might have been married in love and blessed by the bishop, but that didn't mean you could enjoy each other whenever you liked. The church had very specific thoughts about when intimacy was allowed, and those thoughts meticulously documented in confessional manuals. Sermons and theological treatises could turn your romantic calendar into a minefield of off-limits days. Let's begin with the obvious. Sundays were out. That was the Lord's Day rest prayer and reflection only. No frolicking. Fridays also out, since it was the day of penance. Wednesdays were iffy. Some regions considered them minor fast days depending on the moon phase, the local bishop's mood, and whether someone had recently been caught having too much fun. Then there were the big seasons: Lent, 40 days of abstinence, Advent, another 40, and a generous scatter of feast days, saint days, and holy observances that span the calendar like tiny moral landmines. If you were to draw a medieval intimacy calendar, it would look like Swiss cheese full of holes where the church said absolutely not. Historians still debate how rigorously these prohibitions were enforced across different regions. In stricter dioceses, violators were fined, shamed, or required to confess with cringe-inducing detail. In more rural areas, the priest might wink and look the other way, especially if he was married himself, unofficially, of course. But officially, the church's stance was clear. Intimacy was for reproduction only. Pleasure was a dangerous distraction, and unnecessary contact even within marriage risked leading the soul astray. This wasn't just abstract morality. Bishops wrote full instructions detailing how married couples should behave in the bedroom. Spoiler, not enthusiastically. One 13th century guide stated couples should be without lust, without sin, and without delay. Essentially, no smiling, no lingering. And please finish before the rooster crows. For most couples, navigating this was tricky. You couldn't just act on desire, you had to cross-check the calendar. Remember who was being canonized that week, and possibly consult your confessor about whether Tuesday was a safe bet. There's a fringe account from a French abbey where monks compiled an intimacy almanac, a chart of safe days, colored in green with all others marked red or black. The notes include such gems as no contact on the feast of Saint Apollonius, protector of dental purity. One can only imagine the theological reasoning behind that. Even married couples were not exempt from scrutiny. Confessors were trained to ask specific questions, not just if couples had been intimate, but how, when, and whether they had enjoyed it too much. This gave medieval clergy an almost surreal level of insight into everyone's most private moments. The result: a culture of caution, couples developed complex rituals to signal interest without drawing suspicion. Some used devotional metaphors. Shall we say a private prayer together might be code for, let's make the most of this non-fasting Tuesday? Of course not. Everyone played by the rules. Many peasants juggling livestock, weather, and survival had little patience for liturgical calendars. If the crops were good and the children were asleep, that was reason enough. Some clergy knew this and practiced selective enforcement preaching, strict doctrine on Sunday, and minding their own business the rest of the week. But for those who took the church's guidance seriously, the bedroom became a space of moral anxiety. Even in moments of affection, there was the nagging question, is this allowed? And so desire, natural, spontaneous human, became entangled with guilt. Fear and a calendar thicker than most medieval novels. Which brings us back to tonight, lying quietly, hands folded, listening to the distant bells that remind you not tonight. Maybe next Tuesday. Maybe. Tuesday morning, mid-April. Not a feast day, not a fast day, not even a minor saint's birthday. The bells haven't rung, the weather's calm, and the priest is off visiting a nearby parish. You look at your partner and think this might be the safest opportunity you've had in weeks, and all it took was an encyclopedic knowledge of ecclesiastical scheduling. It's almost funny, really. The idea that your love life hinges not on passion or connection, but on the absence of liturgical obligations. Medieval couples, particularly the devout, had to master what we might call spiritual intimacy scheduling. Not exactly romantic, but undeniably necessary. A fringe text from a 12th century English monastery includes a list of permissible days for conjugal union, sandwiched between two lists of prohibited fish. According to it, couples had roughly 100 to 130 permissible days a year. That's if no one was ill traveling or, surrounded by family members pretending to be asleep 3 feet away. So, yes, maybe Tuesday morning in April really was as good as it got. And it wasn't just the church laying out restrictions. Folk traditions and local beliefs added their own complications. Some communities believed intimacy during certain moon phases could result in cursed pregnancies. Others thought certain days produced children destined for bad luck or worse poetry. Imagine trying to avoid conception not just for economic or personal reasons, but because you feared birthing a future lute player. Historians still argue whether couples strictly adhered to these prohibitions or simply absorbed them into the cultural background noise. Some likely tried their best to comply, genuinely fearing spiritual consequences. Others smiled, nodded during sermons, and did whatever felt right after dark. Either way, the constant navigation bred an intimacy that was deliberate. Each moment had to be considered, weighed, and timed, not unlike a carefully planned heist. Only instead of stealing gold, you were stealing affection from under the nose of St. Augustine. Even among those less devout, the church's influence was hard to avoid. Everyone knew the rules. Breaking them didn't just risk divine judgment, it risked social censure. A neighbor hearing laughter during Lent might not say anything outright, but you'd feel it in the way they handed you your eggs the next morning. Cold. Judging. Possibly cracked. There's something almost tender about how people responded to these restrictions. Some couples kept little charms or saints' medallions under their pillows, hoping for divine leniency. Others whispered apologies after not out of guilt, but just in case someone holy was listening. And of course, there were the whispered loopholes. If we don't fully undress, it's probably fine. If we're doing it in complete silence, it barely counts. One anonymous confession preserved in a Florentine manuscript simply reads, "Forgive me, Father, we lit no candles." Let's not forget the added pressure of reproduction. Since pleasure wasn't the point, at least officially couples were expected to be open to conception at all times. That meant even the most fleeting moment of connection came with heavy implications. You weren't just risking spiritual backlash. You might end up with another child, another mouth to feed, and another baptism to schedule. Some theologians even recommended that couples abstain completely unless actively trying to conceive. This led to what might be the most unintentionally comedic quote in medieval marital literature: "Let not the couple meet unless the wife be fecund and the wind be still." One assumes they meant literal wind, but either way it was a high bar to clear. And yet, in spite of all these hurdles, or maybe because of them, many couples found ways to nurture real intimacy. Quiet, patient, often unspoken. Not every connection needs candles and music. Sometimes it's enough to know that today is Tuesday, the priest is away, and the saints are busy with someone else's problems. So you take your partner's hand beneath the covers. The morning sun creeps through the shutters. And for once the calendar is kind. You've checked the calendar twice. It's not a feast day. It's not Lent. The moon isn't full. There's no sermon in the morning. And you're fairly certain St. Gertrude of Nivelle has no particular objections to what's about to happen. Still, you hesitate because you're thinking about posture. Specifically, you're thinking about the posture, the one the church deemed acceptable, the only one really. You glance at your partner and try to remember if it's okay to make eye contact. It's probably not, but who can say for sure? Welcome to the missionary position, also known in medieval theology as the natural order, the holy arrangement, or if you're feeling less generous, the only option because everything else might offend angels. The church didn't just ban certain days, it regulated the act itself. And it had opinions. Strong ones. The prevailing view was that intimacy had one purpose: reproduction. Anything that strayed from that goal even slightly was suspect. Pleasure was tolerated only insofar as it nudged the soul toward the creation of more little souls. Any sign of indulgence or enjoyment was treated as a spiritual red flag. Historians still debate the origins of these restrictions. Were they rooted in theological logic, Roman tradition, or just general medieval discomfort with bodies? Either way, the outcome was clear. Married couples were expected to approach each other with modesty, restraint, and ideally a complete lack of enthusiasm. Missionary position safe. Reverent. Facing heaven literally. Anything else questionable at best. Dangerous at worst. One 13th century manual warned against sideways joining, lest it lead to confusion in the soul or unwanted influence from spirits of the air. Another cautioned that turning one's back to heaven during the act invited demonic interference. Try explaining that to your confessor. One fringe text, a sort of clerical Q&A, asked whether lying on one's side counted as sin if one was infirm or just sleepy. The answer: only if no other option exists. And even then confess promptly, so basically yes, but shamefully. There were layers to the disapproval. Prolonged foreplay was discouraged. Kissing was acceptable, but only when it arose from duty and not desire. Touching was tolerated in silence and humility. Expressions of passion? Absolutely not. Laughter, highly suspicious, smiling. Better not. Confessors were even trained to quiz married parishioners about whether their intimacy had been performed with distraction or with delight. One penitent reportedly asked, "What if I was surprised by my own joy?" The priest's response: "A week of fasting and no meat." which seems doubly unfair. And yet despite all this, people still cared for each other. They still found ways to connect. Within the strict framework of approved behavior, some couples developed a quiet rebellion, holding hands longer than necessary, whispering jokes in bed, or gently defying the expectation of spiritual detachment. It wasn't always easy. Couples who had a natural sense of chemistry might feel guilt. Those who didn't might feel broken. And the weight of spiritual policing could press into the most tender parts of a relationship. One nobleman's diary lamented, "I desire her as the flowers desire the sun, but the priest says I must be as stone." Whether he followed the advice is unclear. For many peasants, though, all of this was academic. Life was already hard. If your roof leaked, your ox was sick, and your neighbor was borrowing your butter without asking, you might not worry too much about posture. Many simply did what felt right quietly, quickly, and without checking the rule book. There's even evidence of regional humor around the subject. One folktale from Bohemia describes a couple who tried a new position and were immediately visited by a talking goat with a bishop's voice, warning them to return to the blessed angle. It was predictably a joke, but the goat became a recurring symbol in local bawdy songs. So, what do you do lying beside someone you love in a world where affection is policed by saints and scribes? You do what people have always done. You make room for warmth, for eye contact, for a shared laugh when the wind slams the shutter at exactly the wrong moment. And perhaps you whisper a silent apology to St. Augustine just in case. After all, he wasn't watching. Probably. You kneel beside the confession booth, your hands clasped tightly. The air smells faintly of old wood incense and something darker anticipation, maybe. On the other side of the screen, the priest clears his throat and begins. He doesn't ask whether you've lied, stolen, or failed to attend Mass. No. He asks something far more specific. Did you and your spouse feel excessive delight in your joining? You blink. You hadn't expected that. In the medieval world, confession wasn't just a spiritual reset button. It was surveillance, personal, theological, and deeply awkward. Especially when it came to the topic of intimacy. For centuries, priests were instructed to probe not just your sins, but your pleasures. And if you were married, that meant your bed. Confessional manuals, meticulously written guides for clergy listed dozens of questions to help uncover what might be called marital misconduct, even when both parties were lawfully wed. Historians still argue how often these questions were actually asked in practice, but the instructions were certainly detailed enough to give anyone second thoughts. Did you enjoy it too much? Were you too eager? Did you use words that were affectionate? Did you delay the act for the sake of pleasure? Did you, heaven forbid, laugh? These questions weren't designed to humiliate. At least not officially. They were part of a larger belief that the soul must remain vigilant even during moments of love. The idea was that sin didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it slipped in through sighs and softness, disguised as happiness. Some confessors took a gentle tone, asking indirectly, giving couples the benefit of the doubt. Others were far less subtle. There are reports of priests who grilled their parishioners with near interrogation levels of scrutiny. One particularly devout friar from Saxony is said to have carried a handwritten checklist titled, "Affections Most Likely to Offend Our Lord." Modern readers might be tempted to laugh, but to a medieval soul these moments were deadly serious. Eternal salvation could hang on the answer to whether you closed your eyes too sensually during an otherwise liturgically scheduled Tuesday. Of course, this led to some creative fibbing. One widow, writing in her private diary, admitted, "I told him we were without joy. It was not true, but I could not bear his eyes upon me." Quiet defiance dressed in humility. Others navigated the system more playfully. A Flemish merchant reportedly told his priest that he and his wife conducted intimacy with the same seriousness as business, which the priest apparently found acceptable. The wife later wrote, "We smiled about that all year." Confession also acted as a strange kind of therapy, albeit one with guilt baked in. Couples often didn't discuss these things with each other. So for some, this was the only space where their feelings conflicted. Confused or contrary to doctrine could be spoken aloud. Yet confession cut both ways. There are accounts of confessors who were unusually compassionate, who quietly encouraged affection, and who saw joy between spouses as a gift, not a danger. These voices were rare, but they did exist, gentle murmurs amid the thunderclaps of ecclesiastical severity. Then again, not all priests kept secrets well. Gossip flowed from the confession booth faster than water from a cracked cistern in some villages. Parishioners knew this. One particularly sardonic monk joked that a woman should confess to her laundry line, for it holds its tongue better than her priest. The cultural effects were lasting. Even in the most loving marriages, there lingered a hesitancy, a shadow cast over the most human of connections. The idea that even joy could be suspect shaped not only how people behaved, but how they felt about behaving. Guilt became a partner in the bed, whispering alongside the wind, and still people adapted. They gave honest confessions or carefully curated ones. They took penance with a smile and kept the deeper parts of their joy for each other. After all, intimacy wasn't just about bodies, it was about complicity. About knowing when to nod solemnly and when to let your eyes laugh instead. So when you next think of confession, don't just picture dim light and hushed voices. Picture someone balancing theology and tenderness with one foot in duty and the other in devotion. A medieval tightrope walk across the altar of affection. The embers of the hearth still glow faintly, and you lie awake, your partner's hand loosely in yours. It had been a rare evening, no holy day, no snoring relatives, no livestock erupting into mid-dream bleats. You'd even managed to kiss. A real one. But now, lying in the soft warmth of closeness, an uncomfortable thought creeps in. Did you enjoy it too much? Because in medieval Christendom, enjoyment was not the goal, it was the warning sign. To be clear, the church never outright banned marital intimacy. That would have led to a demographic disaster. But what it did do was define the boundaries in increasingly narrow, joyless terms. The idea was that physical union was, for one thing, only procreation. Anything beyond that affection, pleasure, desire was a spiritual risk, a temptation, a slippery slope that could tumble you straight into hell, or at least back to the confessional booth with another awkward conversation. Saint Jerome, a voice who echoes like a thundercloud through medieval doctrine, once claimed that even within marriage, desire was a weakness. He advised married couples to live as though they were celibate if they could bear it, preferably with separate beds, or possibly separate castles. Historians still argue over whether this stance was ever fully internalized by lay people. For most peasants who had more pressing concerns like weather taxes and surviving winter, this sort of saintly abstinence was less of a religious ideal and more of a theological luxury, like owning a second cloak. But for those who did absorb the church's teachings, the result could be a strange sort of emotional detachment, even in deeply loving marriages. Couples were expected to approach each other with solemnity like co-managers of a pious enterprise, not as partners in mutual joy. A quick prayer before, no eye contact during, and immediate repentance afterward ideal. It's no wonder then that many tried to bury their pleasure under layers of guilt. One letter from a 14th century wife to her confessor reads, "I felt lightness in my chest and laughter came after. I feared I had erred in the flesh." The priest's reply was simple: fast 2 days and recite psalms before sunrise. One gets the sense he may have been unsure what to do with someone admitting to happiness. Some theologians even warned that excessive affection could invite demonic attention. Not metaphorical demons, the literal kind, winged and nosy. A few texts advise couples to keep a crucifix in view during marital acts, both as a ward and as a reminder that yes, Jesus is technically watching. No pressure. A fringe story from a Bohemian village tells of a statue of the Virgin Mary that wept every time a newlywed couple consummated their marriage with too much enthusiasm. The villagers eventually covered the statue with a cloth so the poor Holy Mother might rest. Whether this was sincere or satire remains unknown, but it says a lot either way. Despite the grim messaging, couples still found ways to preserve tenderness. In secret, in silence, in ways that let them care without alerting the angels. Small gestures mattered: an extra squeeze of the hand, a smile when no one else was looking, the long process of learning each other within the space allowed. And sometimes the church itself softened just a little. Not all clerics were dour. Some, especially in rural parishes, understood that love was not a sin, and that warmth between spouses was not necessarily a trap door to eternal damnation. A few even suggested that joy in marriage was a reflection of divine unity. Radical for the time. But these were the exceptions. More often, a couple's love was shadowed by the expectation of detachment. Joy was fleeting. Laughter was suspicious. Intimacy was something to survive, not savor. And yet, somehow people did savor it, even when they weren't supposed to. Even when doctrine frowned and saints glared from stained glass windows. They found moments. Moments in which guilt loosened its grip and warmth flowed freely. A reminder that beneath all the rules and restrictions, two people still existed, imperfect, hopeful, and human. So, tonight, as you lie in bed with someone you've chosen, maybe you do smile. Just a little, just enough. Because you've earned it. You wake early as you always do. The rooster is still thinking about crowing, and the cold air hasn't yet been chased off by the hearth. You stretch glance at your partner still wrapped in linen, and smile at the memory of last night. Brief quiet, perhaps a bit rushed, but real. And maybe most importantly, guilt-free. Because unlike your noble cousins juggling alms confessors in the ever-watchful eyes of saints carved into their bedroom walls, you're a peasant. And the rules don't always stick the same out here. Life in the fields doesn't leave much time for spiritual hand-wringing over whether Tuesday was officially sanctioned for physical affection. If you're lucky you've got enough grain in the storehouse, your only surviving chicken laid an egg, and your neighbor isn't threatening to sue you over a disputed rutabaga patch. Whether you smiled in bed, low priority. Among peasants, the church's rules were often treated with polite nods and selective application. Sure, you showed up for Mass confessed when needed and avoided scandal when possible. But when it came to affection behind closed or rather curtainless doors, practicality had a louder voice than theology. Historians still debate just how widespread this quiet defiance was. But village records, folk songs, and even confession logs suggest that peasants knew the rules and then quite often ignored them. Not out of rebellion, just necessity. When your home is one room, your family sleeps in a tangle of limbs beside the hearth, and your ox is more important than your local bishop, your priorities shift. You find time for love where you can, in the barn, in the woods, behind a haystack, or while pretending to check on the smokehouse. A fringe record from a 14th century French village includes a priest's lament that his parishioners treated the holy calendar like a drunk treats a bucket of apples, only noticing it when they trip over it. There's both frustration and admiration in that complaint. Even in matters of confession, peasant honesty had its own flavor. One man reportedly confessed we were together last week, but it was raining and we were cold, and also we wanted to. The priest wrote a mild penance and added a note, wife appears unconcerned. Husband smiling. There was a rhythm to peasant life that the church didn't fully understand. It pulsed with the seasons, with planting and harvest, with hunger and recovery. In that cycle, affection wasn't indulgent, it was restorative. It was how people reminded themselves they were still human after a day of slogging through wet fields and arguing over cheese rations. And let's not overlook humor. While noble texts were full of fire and brimstone warnings, village humor often poked fun at church prohibitions. Songs passed down through generations made jokes about couples sneaking kisses during holy days, or about priests who preached chastity by day and visited the miller's wife by night. One particularly persistent folktale tells of a village couple who prayed to Saint Agnes for blessing in the bed, and then claimed their child was born with a holy halo of wheat around his head. Whether they believed it or not is unclear, but the story stuck. And yet, even among peasants, discretion mattered. Walls were thin. Gossip was thick. A young couple caught canoodling behind the granary might be fined, married off, or subjected to a very dramatic tongue lashing from the local alewife. Still, the punishment rarely fit the supposed sin. Most communities understood that love, however clumsy or badly timed, was part of life. More than that, it was something to protect, to laugh about, and sometimes to bend the rules for. Because when survival is hard, affection isn't a luxury. It's a small rebellion against cold nights, aching backs, and the endless worry of what the next season might bring. So tonight, you don't recite a long prayer before reaching out. You don't double-check the calendar or whisper apologies to the Virgin Mary. You reach for the one person who shares your straw bed, your chores, your laughter, and your life. Quietly, without ceremony, without sin. The village is quiet tonight, just the wind humming through thatched roofs and the occasional creak of wood expanding in the cold. You lie in bed wrapped in the same blanket that smells faintly of sheep herbs and last month's stew. It's not luxurious, but it's home. And across from you, two children sleep huddled together, snoring gently. Intimacy, if it happens, must be a careful dance in the shadows. In the medieval peasant home, privacy was a concept more imagined than real. One-room houses were standard for most families, and everyone from newborns to great-grandparents shared the same space. The hearth was the heart of the home, and everything else, meals, rest arguments, intimacy unfolded around it. So, where did love live in all this quietly? Historians still debate how couples navigated intimacy under such watchful and often unconscious eyes. There are no instruction manuals on how to make love while your grandmother is snoring 2 feet away, but the answers are implied in folklore, anecdote, and the simple fact that people kept having babies. Creative solutions were common. Couples might wait until others were out tending livestock or at church. A walk into the woods ostensibly to gather herbs might become an opportunity for closeness. Barns, stables, riverbanks, and even abandoned sheds took on new roles as sanctuaries of affection. Not glamorous, perhaps, but effective. There's a fringe court record from Devonshire in 1386 involving a farmer who accused his neighbor of violating the sanctity of the barley stack, suggesting that even sacred hay wasn't safe from the occasional romantic tryst. Despite the awkward logistics, these moments often carried more tenderness than any curtained bedchamber. When time, space, and warmth were scarce, affection became sharper, more meaningful. A glance across the table, a soft joke. A hand resting just a moment longer on a shoulder while fetching water. These weren't grand gestures, they were lifelines. That's not to say there weren't rules. While the church's detailed liturgical calendar applied to all enforcement was looser in peasant communities, still a couple caught being too affectionate during Lent might face public penance or at least the judgmental stare of the parish priest. But enforcement varied wildly, often depending on whether the priest had anything better to do. One 15th century rural sermon scolded couples who were so eager in flesh that they forget the rooster's cry. The implication being it wasn't just what you did, it was when. Still, the peasant attitude toward intimacy was pragmatic. There were children to raise, animals to feed, fields to tend. If love fit between those obligations, wonderful. If not, it waited, or it wandered. Because of the lack of privacy, fidelity became flexible, not always by choice. The traveling tinker, the bored shepherd, the visiting soldier, they all appear frequently in ballads and complaints, and not always in flattering ways. Yet these communities also valued forgiveness. People gossiped, yes, but they also understood. Love was messy like pig pens and spring rains. Sometimes people made mistakes. Sometimes people just needed kindness, or a blanket that didn't smell of goat. It's worth noting that affection between spouses wasn't always romantic in the way we'd define it today. Marriages were often practical partnerships built on shared survival more than emotional compatibility. But affection grew. Through time, through shared work, through weathering hunger, childbirth, and the occasional plague. And when a couple did care for each other deeply, that connection stood out. One village record from the Low Countries mentions a woman who continued to sleep on her husband's side of the bed for 10 years after he died for warmth and memory, she explained. That's not doctrine, that's love. So tonight, as the fire crackles low and your entire household dreams around you, you press your shoulder lightly against the one person who understands your life in every hard and hopeful detail. There are no candles, no velvet, just breath and quiet and the sound of someone softly shifting under linen. And somehow, in the middle of everything, that's enough. You awaken just before dawn when the sky is still more ash than blue. Outside, a rooster stirs somewhere in the mist, but the house is still safe for the soft breathing of the people bundled around the hearth. You sit up slowly, careful not to wake the boy curled against your legs. This morning, like every morning, begins with a small miracle survival. In the medieval world, love lived alongside struggle. Romance in the modern sense was often considered secondary or non-existent when survival was the top priority. Yet somehow in homes stitched together with straw and smoke, affection still bloomed, in the smallest of gestures. In what was said, and especially in what wasn't. Today we might think of intimacy as physical touch, as passionate declarations. But back then, sometimes it was a shared crust of bread, or someone saving the last drop of wine, or remembering to pack a warmer cloak when your partner had a cough. Historians still debate how deeply romantic love factored into medieval peasant marriages. Many were arranged or rushed into after-harvest dances or impulsive encounters behind a hayloft. But over time, feelings had space to grow, not in a grand flourish, but in the shape of daily kindness. That's where intimacy found its rhythm and repetition. You rise first not because you must, but because you want to warm the water before she stirs. She mends your socks without saying a word, humming while her fingers work. Neither of you say, "I love you." Those words weren't part of your language, but the meaning is clear when she saves the sweetest fig for your supper. One fringe source, a collection of anonymous peasant prayers from Bavaria, includes this line, "Let her sleep 1 hour more, and I shall carry both pails. It's not poetry, but it is love." And even with affection restraint was part of the formula. In an environment where noise traveled, where walls were shared, and every sigh could be overheard, discretion wasn't just respectful, it was survival. Couples developed a private language, a glance, a shoulder, nudge, a touch under the table, a joke said with eyes, not mouths. Despite the quiet, intimacy wasn't absent, it was just hidden in plain sight. And not every relationship was soft. There were quarrels too. Tired bodies, bad tempers, crop failures. But even in those moments, the bonds endured. You didn't walk away just because you were annoyed. You didn't demand perfection. You grew together because there wasn't another option, and maybe in a strange way that made it more real. When one fell ill, the other stayed up all night wringing cloths and whispering prayers they barely believed. When one returned late from the woods, the other had soup waiting. No reward, no expectation, just the rhythm of care. The church had little to say about this sort of love. It couldn't be measured by purity or posture or confession. It didn't require saints' approval. It existed beneath doctrine in the realm of survival and small tendernesses. And sometimes that love expressed itself physically, quietly, naturally. Not with permission, but with understanding. No fanfare, just two people who had earned each other's trust through seasons of storms and sickness and laughter. In one folktale, a peasant wife tells her husband, "I like you best when you smell like smoke and salt." He doesn't respond. He just smiles and hands her a warm bowl of porridge. And that's it. That's the entire romance. So tonight, when the chores are done and the moon watches silently through the slats in the roof, you reach for a familiar hand. You don't ask. You don't need to. This isn't about rules or rituals. This is about being seen, being known, and maybe if you're lucky, being held. You find yourself trudging through the marketplace, boots caked in spring mud-eyes, scanning the stalls more out of habit than hunger. Everything smells of wet wool, onions, and livestock, except for that one corner near the apothecary where someone's baking honey bread. You catch a whiff and think of her. She likes honey bread. You remember that. You remember odd things, really, how she tucks her sleeve, just so when she kneads dough the way she hums, before she's even aware of it. You don't remember your wedding day clearly. There was rain and goats and someone dropped the bread, but you remember the way she smiled when no one else was looking. That stayed with you longer than the vows. In medieval towns, love and desire didn't always come wrapped in parchment and sealed with a bishop's ring. They often grew out of proximity, neighbors, fellow apprentices, or the girl who passed you a jug of cider at the midsummer feast. Romance was less about grand gestures and more about the accumulation of shared life. Historians still argue whether courtly love, the stuff of troubadours and ladies in towers, had any bearing on the real lives of townsfolk. Probably not. But that doesn't mean urban love wasn't poetic in its own right. A butcher might slip a ribbon into his apprentice's apron. A blacksmith's daughter might leave a carved heart on the underside of a workbench. And in the dark corners of inns or behind ale carts glances were exchanged, that meant far more than a sermon ever could. But navigating urban intimacy wasn't easy. Towns were dense, both with buildings and with eyes. Gossip moved faster than rats, and once your name was on a rumor, it rarely came off clean. There were consequences for being careless. A merchant's daughter caught sneaking kisses behind the tannery might be married off before she could argue. A widow too friendly with a stable hand might find her rent doubled overnight. One fringe case from York in 1372 tells of a couple who met in secret for 3 years, leaving coded chalk marks on doorways to signal safe nights. Eventually, they were caught not by a priest, but by a jealous neighbor who wanted the girl's help with candle making. Despite the risks, people fell in love anyway. They always have. Even in alleyways that reeked of horse dung. Even with curfews and watchmen and the threat of ecclesiastical fines. For many, marriage was the safest way to legitimize affection. But even then, town councils and guilds had their own rules. Who could marry whom, when, and how much dowry was required. Love might have bloomed under eaves and in workshops, but it had to pass through bureaucracy before it could breathe. Still, couples made it work. A cobbler and a laundress might not have had a church-blessed wedding, but they'd share bread-raised children and sleep side by side in a loft above the shop. No witnesses, no feast, just quiet commitment stitched together with years. There's something deeply human about these small romances, the kind where you know someone's cough, their bad knee, their favorite corner of the bed. Not stories of star-crossed nobles, but of two people deciding again and again to face the world together. So now, as you leave the marketplace with nothing but a half loaf and the taste of honey bread still lingering, you glance back. She's not there, of course. She's home probably cursing at the firewood. But tonight when you walk in smelling like the streets and spring rain, she'll wrinkle her nose and say, "You forgot the onions, didn't you?" And you'll grin, because yes, you absolutely did. It's almost dark by the time you make it home. The sky has turned the color of old iron and the first stars blink into view. You unlatch the crooked door and there she is, face flushed from the hearth sleeves, rolled muttering to herself about soup that refuses to thicken. You cross the threshold wet from the knees down and she doesn't look up. Just says, "Put your boots near the fire." You're not dripping across my floor again. That's love. Right there. Not a sonnet, not a serenade, but a soup-splattered threat that smells of time and home. In medieval towns, affection had to adapt to noise crowding and routine. There were no candlelit dinners, no weekends away, and certainly no dating apps. Romance unfolded between tasks, between splitting firewood and milking goats, between mending a tunic and dodging chamber pots tossed from upper windows. And somehow those interruptions made the affection more grounded. You didn't have time to overthink it. You just had time to be to work beside someone, speak less, mean more. Historians still argue whether these working marriages had less emotional depth than romantic unions. But surviving diaries and letters suggest otherwise. Love in these contexts was often expressed through service protection and fierce loyalty rather than poetic language. One woman from Lübeck wrote in her household book, "He does not say much, but he carries the bucket when my shoulder is sore." That line, barely a flicker on the parchment, says more than 100 lines of court poetry. And this wasn't just about men to women. Wives stitched work shirts with careful fingers, packed midday bread in cloth to keep it warm, or stepped between their husbands and a too loud town guard during festivals. Love was loud in its quietness. Sometimes the closest thing to flirtation came in the form of teasing, at the communal well, in line at the baker's, across the candle stalls. "Your firewood's as crooked as your legs," one tanner might say. "At least I don't burn the soup like you," she'd reply, eyebrows raised. And then a smile. And that was that. Of course, not all affection stayed innocent. Towns had their share of secrets, affairs assignations, backroom confessions whispered to sympathetic priests. The crowded alleys and proximity made temptation frequent. But so did guilt. One friar in Norwich wrote that city sin was like soot always clinging even when scrubbed. That might be more poetic than helpful, but it gives you an idea of the urban tension between indulgence and restraint. And yet, even in the messiness, people tried to do right by each other. Tried to be better. Sometimes failed. Then tried again. There's one especially touching letter fragment found in a merchant's home in Ghent. A husband writes to his wife while away on trade, "I miss how you pinch the crust from the pie when you think I am not looking. I miss the sound of your scolding. I miss your breath beside mine because without it, I forget how to sleep. It's unpolished, a little silly, and completely honest." So tonight you sit beside your partner by the fire. You tell her about the market. She tells you the soup still tastes like boiled shoe. You both laugh. Later, when the rest of the house is quiet, you might touch her hand under the blanket. Say nothing. Say everything. Because this is what intimacy looks like when it's built on days, not declarations. On knowing, not imagining who lies beside you. The fire's down to embers now. You poke it once half-heartedly, then let it settle into its glow. The room is cloaked in flickering orange shadows, the kind that make everything feel softer, older, truer. Your partner has dozed off beside you, her head tilted, just so arms crossed as if daring dreams to try anything funny. You sit there a moment longer because sleep can wait, and because this stillness, this quiet companionship is a kind of intimacy that doesn't get written about much. In medieval towns, this was the reality love as a shared silence. As warmth passed between bodies, not just for comfort, but because you'd done the day together. You'd survived it. Again. It's easy now, centuries later, to romanticize medieval affection as either wildly repressed or impossibly passionate. But the truth lies somewhere between, and it's quieter than you'd expect. Most love stories weren't grand. They were subtle, slow-burning, and folded into the corners of ordinary life. Historians still debate whether love before the modern era looked anything like what we recognize today. Did medieval couples fall for each other? Did they pine-long ache, or did they simply cooperate, make do, and hope? Feelings followed. Evidence suggests all of the above. The church, of course, tried to steer things. Marriage was a sacrament, a duty, a contract with divine consequences. Affection wasn't forbidden, but it was rarely emphasized. The ideal couple was obedient, fertile, and respectable, not necessarily thrilled to see each other after a long day at the fish market. Yet people still carved initials into wooden beams, still exchanged little tokens, ribbons, pressed flowers, scraps of parchment with clumsy verses. One tailor from Rouen was buried with a tiny embroidered cloth tucked in his tunic. The inscription, "To G, who speaks kindly even when I burn the broth." You don't write that unless you're in love. There was also a surprising amount of humor in medieval romance, especially among commoners. One surviving manuscript includes a list of humorous pickup lines likely compiled by an amused scribe. Gems include, "Thy hair is like unto swine's bristle, yet I find thee comely, and though thy nose bends left, I would still share my barley with thee." Sincerity and sarcasm often held hands. In many urban households, couples lived above their work, literally. A cobbler's family would sleep in the loft above the shop, the scent of leather and oil seeping into every pillow. A baker's children would fall asleep to the thump of kneaded dough below. Love had to breathe in flour dust and sore feet. It had to grow in small spaces under pressure. and somehow it did. One fringe account from a notary's ledger in Florence records a legal dispute over a broken betrothal contract. The reason given: the groom laughed at her singing voice. She responded by pelting him with pears. The contract was voided. The pears presumably were bruised. It's a reminder emotions were very real and sometimes very loud. Yet for every dramatic falling out, there were hundreds of quiet successes relationships that never made it into the records because they didn't scandalize or collapse. Just two people working side by side year after year building something steadier than poetry. So now as the fire cools and the room breathes in rhythm with sleep, you draw the blanket up around both of you. You think about the day. The bread, the boots, the soup that tasted less like shoe this time. And you think not for the first time that you're lucky. Not because life is easy. Not because love is simple, but because somehow in this tangled, candle-smoked, church-shadowed world, you've found someone whose presence makes all of it a little warmer. You lean back, close your eyes, and whisper, not a prayer, not a vow, just a thank you. Quiet and meant. Morning returns like it always does, gently and without apology. Light slips through the cracks in the shutters. Dust dances in its beam, and outside someone is already shouting about fish. You roll over, stretch your legs, and feel a familiar ache in your back. The bed, if you can call it that, is mostly straw, slightly damp from the weather, and smells faintly of old wool. But it's yours. And so is the person sleeping next to you. The medieval household was in many ways an organism alive, humming and constantly adjusting. Beds were not separate from the daily chaos. They were part of it. Children, dogs, food sacks, the occasional chicken, all shared space. Privacy was rare. Boundaries were more suggestion than structure. And yet somehow within all of that clutter, intimacy found a way. Historians still debate the extent to which married love shaped daily life. Some argue that companionship was born from repetition, shared chores, meals, and hardships. Others believe that affection was more foundational, with couples choosing each other less for status and more for a certain spark. One German legal document from the 15th century details a case in which a man sued for the return of a chicken he had gifted to a woman with the intent of courtship. She kept the chicken. The case was dismissed. Whether their relationship survived the poultry-based tension is unknown, but the story suggests a mix of romance humor and legal creativity. In townhouses and farmsteads alike, bed sharing was routine, and not just with the spouse. Apprentices, cousins, servants, anyone needing warmth might share a mattress. In such close quarters, whispered conversations took on added weight. So did stolen glances, secret smiles, and middle-of-the-night hand-holding beneath scratchy wool blankets. Of course, this closeness wasn't always consensual or safe. Power imbalances were everywhere between masters and servants, lords and maids, merchants and debtors. There's a darker side to intimacy in the medieval world, one that the records only hint at and the poetry often ignores. But tonight we're focused on the other side, the quiet, mutual kind. One fringe anecdote tells of a woman who embroidered her husband's name into the lining of his hat, not where it could be seen, but where it would rest against his brow. When he died, she refused to bury him with it. She said, "That piece is still mine." Small gestures, enormous meaning. Even bedding materials could tell the story. A couple with 2 pillows instead of 1 was often seen as unusually fortunate, or just unusually committed to not elbowing each other during the night. Mattresses made of feathers instead of straw were a sign of wealth, but also tenderness. Whoever spent the extra coin likely did so with someone else's comfort in mind. And in cities where inns were common but rooms were shared, traveling couples developed subtle ways to mark their territory, folding cloaks over a bedpost, placing shoes heel to toe. Signals, warnings, invitations, all encoded in the quiet language of companionship. It's easy now to imagine medieval marriage as joyless as a contract enforced by church and family. But the lived reality, at least for many, was much richer. It was about continuity, resilience, and the subtle art of making room for someone else in your day, your bed, and your plans for tomorrow. So, as you rise this morning, rubbing sleep from your eyes and trying not to wake your partner too soon, you think of what comes next. Bread to bake, boots to patch, chickens to chase. Another day in the long rhythm of shared living. And maybe as she turns over and murmurs something half asleep and half sarcastic, you smile. Because yes, the soup might burn again tonight. The roof might leak. The kids might smear goose fat on the dog. But you'll face it together. Later that morning, while scrubbing yesterday's soot off a skillet with a fistful of rushes, you pause to listen. Not for danger or for gossip, but for the sound of her singing. It's faint, a hum rising from the other room as she folds linen or combs the children's hair. It's not a hymn, not something learned from the monks. It's something old and wordless passed from her mother, and likely from mothers before that. And you realize this is her contentment. In the medieval household, music wasn't just for courtly minstrels or church choirs. It threaded through ordinary life, sung while churning butter, while carrying water, while weaving in the evening light. And often it was women who sang. Their voices weren't trained, but they were sure. Because in a world where formal declarations of love were rare, singing became a kind of soft rebellion. A way to feel and be heard without being interrupted. Historians still argue how often women were permitted to express joy openly, especially in matters of affection. Church texts warned against vanity, against flirtation, against songs that excite the passions. But the songs persisted. In every language, in every dialect, passed from breath to breath, in kitchens and courtyards and under canopies of stars. One fringe example survives in a 14th century manuscript from Provence, a scrap of linen bearing the lyrics of a love song stitched in uneven thread. The last line reads, "If I must sweep the earth, let it be with you behind me." Not quite courtly, not quite modest, entirely human. Even in work there was affection. You'd see it in how she lined your boots with wool when your cough returned, or how you saved her the unburnt edge of the loaf. These gestures didn't come with ceremony. They came with a rhythm like verses in a song you both knew by heart. Intimacy wasn't only in touch, it was in labor. Shared work made affection practical. Washing laundry together became an opportunity for laughter. Collecting firewood might end with a kiss behind a tree. One blacksmith's wife reportedly tied scraps of red thread around finished horseshoes her husband made, calling them his blessings. She said it kept the bad spirits out. He said it was because she liked the color. And they both were right. Not every moment was gentle. Tempers flared, chores piled, children squabbled, but affection wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. About remembering, even in anger, that love was still the foundation beneath the noise. At times, entire communities notice these bonds. Neighbors might joke about how loudly she yells his name or how quickly he runs when she calls. These weren't insults. They were acknowledgments. Evidence of a bond that had survived the wear and tear of weather taxes and the ever-creaking demands of time. One rare letter from a merchant's apprentice in Bruges writes home to his mother. They bicker like dogs, but when he got hurt at the docks, she did not sleep until his hand was whole. A love story wrapped in a complaint. perhaps the most honest kind. So you finish the pan, rinse your hands, and dry them on the same towel she always insists is only for guests. She catches you, of course. Raises an eyebrow. You shrug. And she doesn't say anything, just hums a little louder. Later, you'll walk to the edge of town, buy onions you forgot yesterday, and see if the baker's got any of that honey bread left. Not because it's a feast day, but because it's Tuesday. And that's enough of a reason to bring something sweet home to someone who makes even soot scrubbing feel a little like poetry. You pass through the town gate just as the afternoon bells begin to toll. Their sound floats down the cobbled lanes like a wave calling children from alleys, reminding merchants to pack up and signaling the end of another day spent surviving. Selling and sidestepping chamber pots. You pull your cloak tighter against the wind and glance down at the bread tucked in your arm. Still warm. She'll like that. As you walk, you nod at faces you know. The cooper and his wife always bickering about wood. The tailor with his crooked fingers and endless stories. And the young couple who married just 2 weeks ago, barely able to keep their hands to themselves in public drawing, scandalized whispers and envious sighs in equal measure. Love in a medieval town was public and private all at once. Courtyards echoed with arguments and laughter. Neighbors knew who snored, who cried, and who sang lullabies after dark. Privacy as we know it didn't really exist, but neither did loneliness in quite the same way. Historians still debate whether medieval people felt love the way we do. But if the stories, letters, and scratched-in beam graffiti are to be trusted, they did. Fiercely. Imperfectly. Honestly. One fringe discovery from a Flemish inn included a poem carved into a bedpost, clearly by someone with limited literacy. It reads, "Her hair like hay. Her hands not soft. I sleep better beside her than alone." You can't fake that kind of truth. And truth mattered in love, especially the kind that had been weathered by time. Town couples who had been together for years, decades, even often developed a sharp-edged kind of affection. Teasing, yes, sarcasm often, but always with an undercurrent of deep, enduring care. You think of a couple in your street, he walks with a limp. She curses like a sailor. They argue loudly over the right way to salt cabbage, but when one is late returning from the market, the other stands in the doorway, peering anxiously down the road. That's love, too. In those days, love wasn't a display, it was a rhythm. It showed up when someone remembered how you liked your eggs. When someone pulled the lice comb through your hair, even though they were tired. When they learned to read just enough to recite a prayer for your name on feast days. One elderly weaver once said, "I knew she loved me when she darned my socks with blue thread, even though gray would have matched." Why blue? Because it reminded him of summer skies? And because she remembered. Of course, affection had to bend around obligations. Guild meetings, curfews, religious holidays. There were dozens of days each year when intimacy was forbidden. Lent, Advent, Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays, feast days, fast days. Frankly, you were running out of options. But that didn't stop people. It just made them more creative. A priest's journal from the 1300s notes that he stopped chastising a particular couple after realizing their feasting always occurred just after Vespers. "I cannot compete with such cleverness," he wrote. "Neither could anyone else. By the time you reach your door, the sun is low. The bell tower chimes once more, and inside you hear the gentle chaos of family. A pot clattering, a child whining, someone laughing. It's not quiet. It's not serene, but it's yours." You push open the door. She looks up, sees the bread, raises an eyebrow. Forgot the onions again. You shrug, smiling. She rolls her eyes and takes the loaf from your hands. Lucky for you, I saved the last of the stew. That's the evening. No declarations, no violins. Just soup bread and someone who knows your habits too well and loves you anyway. Night falls without ceremony. No street lamps light the way, just the moon, spilling its cold silver light across rooftops and rain barrels. You close the shutters, bar the door, and move through the house by memory. The stew's been eaten. The children are tucked in. The fire's down to glowing coals. In the quiet, the world narrows to this single room. One flickering hearth, one shared bed, and two bodies that know the rhythm of each other's sleep. This is intimacy in its truest medieval form, less about passion, more about presence. Not the grand, sweeping gestures of romance ballads, but the steady weight of a hand on a shoulder. The familiar sound of breath in the dark. The knowledge that you are not alone. Historians still argue whether medieval couples sought affection the way we do today. Some claim the emotional dimension of love was a luxury reserved for nobility. Others insist it was fundamental to everyone, a hidden current beneath the surface of everyday survival. And though records are sparse, small truths leak through in household notes, margins of prayer books, and oral traditions passed like heirlooms. One of the more endearing fringe accounts comes from a rural church inventory in 1431, listing, bizarrely, one small wooden figurine of a wife holding bread found beneath floorboards. Possibly a charm, possibly a joke. Possibly a tribute left by someone who missed the way she baked on cold mornings. Even superstition was touched by affection. Couples whispered wishes into shared cups. Wove strands of each other's hair into lockets or pouches. One recipe for a binding charm calls for mixing honey rosemary and the ash of a shared fire, because what's more binding than a shared hearth? Yet love had its rules. The church laid out days and seasons for abstaining, punishing even married couples who dared defy the calendar. But in practice, love wasn't always confined to the pulpit's expectations. It snuck into ordinary hours, hid in shared chores, peered from beneath patched quilts and the cover of festival nights. There's a famous village tale of a couple who were fined for improper merriment during Lent. Their punishment, scrubbing the chapel steps every Sunday for a year. Locals remembered less about the sin than about how the two never missed a week and always left the steps cleaner than they found them. Because affection in its quiet resistance became a sacred thing, not in opposition to faith, but as an extension of it. Loving your spouse wasn't always spiritual, but it was a form of worship of life, of warmth, of the fragile beauty of another person choosing to stay. You blow out the last candle and slide beneath the blankets. The mattress rustles, the bed frame groans, and beside you she shifts instinctively, making space. The room smells of smoke linen and thyme. You breathe it in like a lullaby. And maybe that's what medieval love really was, not a thunderclap, but a hearth that never quite goes out. A presence that lingers, a silence that says, I'm here. Still. Again. So tonight in the dark you reach for her hand. She doesn't speak, doesn't stir, but her fingers close around yours slow and sure. The gesture is old, well-worn, like a prayer you no longer need to recite out loud. You close your eyes. The coals glow, and the night holds you both. The cock crows before dawn, long and sharp like a trumpet, made of feathers and fury. You stir beneath the covers, half dreaming, half listening. Beside you she mutters something in her sleep. Possibly a curse, possibly your name. Either way you smile. You don't rise immediately, the bed is warm. The world beyond it isn't. And the truth is, this quiet moment just before the day begins is when love feels loudest. Not in words, but in warmth, in proximity, in the shared hush of two people postponing the inevitable together. In medieval times, most relationships didn't start with courtship the way we understand it now. There were no love letters by candlelight, no strolls through leafy parks, no holding hands in cafes. Instead, there was work, proximity, convenience, and from that familiarity. Historians still debate how much agency medieval women had in choosing their partners, especially in lower classes. Some argue that peasant marriages were driven largely by family or economic need, but others point to evidence of young women rejecting suitors of elopements and of premarital cohabitation, especially in the towns where church oversight was looser and neighbors more forgiving. One fringe record from a Yorkshire village court in 1394 details a couple fined for clandestine betrothal and impudence by the riverbank. The woman, when questioned, reportedly said, "I would rather pay coin than marry a man without blush," which may be the oldest known example of a romantic mic drop. Still, love wasn't always defiant. Sometimes it was quiet and cooperative. You both wanted chicken's warmth and someone to help with the roof tiles. Affection came later or didn't. And yet more often than not, it did. You throw back the covers and stretch, listening to the house yawn around you. The beams creak, water drips somewhere. From the hearth, the faintest ember still glows loyal as a dog. Your partner stirs. She's already halfway into her morning grumble when she sees the bread you brought yesterday sitting on the shelf. Her expression softens. "You didn't eat it all? I'm not a monster," you say. She smirks. Debatable. And that's the exchange. Not "Good morning, my love." Not a sonnet. Just sass and warmth, and an understanding that no matter how many pots need scrubbing or goats need chasing, you'll face it all side by side. Love lived in these routines, in the way you poured her water before she asked, in how she added an extra pinch of salt because she remembered your mother did, in how you both knew to look for each other first after a loud noise. Even the church, with all its calendars and doctrines, acknowledged the unique bond of marriage. Certain prayers were designated just for husbands and wives, asking for patience, for fertility, for gentleness. But in homes like yours, those prayers were often said silently through action, through daily grace. There's a prayer carved into the wood of a village chapel bench in Somerset. No name, just a line. Let her stay longer. Whether it was about health, love, or just one more night without loneliness, no one knows. But someone took the time to carve it. That says enough. You pull on your tunic. She hands you a cup of weak ale. Neither of you say much as the house wakes around you, but everything important is already understood. Because some mornings the only vow you need is the way someone hands you your boots. Word count 1, zo 95. The wind is sharp by mid-morning, snapping laundry lines and rattling shutters like a bored child, kicking pebbles. You're out mending the fence near the road when she appears at the doorway, arms folded, scarf whipping behind her like a banner of mild disapproval. "You forgot your hood," she calls. You wave it off. "Hair needs the cold to grow strong," you say. "Then you'll have the mightiest scalp in the village," she replies, disappearing inside with a roll of her eyes. That right there is affection in its most medieval form, lightly roasted and seasoned with sarcasm. Not every couple was lucky enough to trade jests and jabs. Many medieval marriages were arranged, even forced, especially among the wealthy. But for the working classes, there was more room to choose. And those who chose well often grew into their partnership like a pair of worn boots, scuffed mismatched, but undeniably meant for walking the same road. Historians still debate the concept of companionate marriage in the Middle Ages. Did people marry for friendship, or did that develop over time? Was it luck strategy, or simply a survival mechanism? The answer, as always, is all three and occasionally none. One fringe letter found tucked into a codex in Vienna reads, "I loved her after she threw cabbage at me." It landed with a grace I could not ignore. Possibly a joke. Possibly the start of something beautiful. Affection often bloomed not during festivals or feasts, but in illness, hardship, and shared grief. When plagues came, when winters bit hard, when crops failed, these were the crucibles of medieval intimacy, not the absence of suffering, but enduring it together. She once spent 3 days nursing you through a fever you recall. No herbs, no healer, just boiled water, wet cloths, and her voice humming something half hymn, half lullaby. You don't remember the pain, you remember her hand on your forehead. There's a kind of love that exists beyond comfort. It's not warm, it's not soft, but it is deep, grounded, unshakable. The kind that doesn't flinch at vomit or bedpans. The kind that sharpens into loyalty so fierce it could outlast a siege. Affection also lived in storytelling. At night, couples would share old legends, riddles, and made-up tales to make each other laugh. Some even told the story of how they met again and again, polishing it into something more amusing or noble with each retelling. She said, "I looked like a wet dog, you once joked." "And you followed me home anyway," she replied. Over the years, the story became your own private folklore. The church didn't quite know what to do with these unruly emotions. They wrote guides about the duties of husbands and the obedience of wives. They warned against lust, against excessive laughter, against dancing too closely at feasts. But no rulebook could legislate the moment when a man kissed the flower off his wife's cheek, or when a woman saved the last plum for her husband. That was sacred in a different way. And sometimes the love was not romantic at all, but still powerful. Two sisters raising children together. An aging widow and her lifelong servant sharing stories by the fire. A traveling journeyman who returned to the same inn every season, just to sit beside the same quiet hostler. Love wore many shapes in the Middle Ages. Not all of them fit in a chapel. You wipe your hands on your tunic and return to the house. She's left a bowl of soup on the hearth for you lukewarm now, but with that particular spice she knows you like. No note, no speech, just soup. And somehow it feels like a sonnet. Afternoon slips into evening like parchment curling in fire. Quiet at first, then suddenly gone. You sit outside on a low stool whittling a scrap of wood into something that might become a spoon or might just be an excuse to sit still. Inside, she sings again. This time a tune you almost recognize, one she hums when she's thinking or remembering. It's in these twilight hours that love feels oldest. Not the passionate kind of springtime fairs or tavern corners, but the durable sort layered, seasoned patient. The kind that's known famine and laughter and patching the same tunic twice. You glance up at the fading light, the smell of smoke rising with the evening damp. Somewhere a dog barks. Somewhere a pot boils too long. And here in the middle of it all sits a life shaped by countless tiny choices. Some yours, some hers, most made together. Historians still argue whether medieval households were driven more by function or feeling, but it's clear that many found deep affection, not in grand moments, but in shared burdens. The shared cartload, the shared silence, the shared fatigue at the end of a long day. One fringe document, a love charm tucked into a thatched roof in Bohemia, contained a single sentence, "May her footsteps always return." It wasn't a wish for wealth, beauty, or even passion, just presence. That was enough. You think of how many evenings you've spent like this, how many spoons you've almost finished, how many moments passed without notice until memory claimed them as treasure. She steps outside now, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're carving again," she says. "Better than eavesdropping," you reply. She sits beside you without asking. Doesn't say much, but her shoulder brushes yours. And in that gesture is everything unsaid: that she's tired, that she's here, that she trusts the quiet. In medieval towns, companionship was often the real love story. Affection grew from proximity, repetition, and survival. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even always kind, but it was consistent. You remember when she stood up to the alderman about that tax increase, called him a puffed-up leech. You were mortified, but later at home you told her she spoke well, and she said, "I wasn't speaking for me." There's a kind of love that roars quietly. One couple from a Norwich parish was known to argue constantly, but when the wife fell ill, the husband refused to let the priest prepare her for death. "She's not going anywhere," he said. She recovered. They were married 42 years. Love like that is messy, defiant, holy in its own way. You hand her the spoon. She inspects it. "This is your 4th one this month." "I'm perfecting the curve." She smiles. "It's ugly. I'll keep it." The stars begin to blink into view one by one. Above roofs and chimneys and the soft swirl of smoke from every home. You sit a while longer side by side, letting the day exhale. Later you'll head inside. Blow out the lanterns, tuck in the children. You'll argue over who left the door unlatched, and you'll both pretend not to remember it was you. But in that argument is safety. In that ritual is warmth. And in that warmth is the kind of love that doesn't get sung about, but that everyone secretly wants. There's rain in the air by dawn. Not falling yet, just hovering like a promise or a warning. You feel it in your knees as you lace your boots, and she feels it too. She says nothing, but she puts the good cloak near the door without asking. That's how love speaks when it's tired of repeating itself. This morning will be market day, which means bartering, elbowing mud, and an enthusiastic crowd of sellers yelling over one another about fish flax and onions that absolutely are not spoiled, thank you very much. You step outside and she follows, handing you a bundle wrapped in cloth cheese bread, a few dried herbs. "Try not to trade for anything ridiculous," she says. "No promises," you reply, and she grins, just slightly. Enough. In medieval towns, the marketplace was more than just commerce. It was theater courtroom, church steps, tavern spillover, and dating app, all in one. Couples shop together or separately, but always with eyes alert for better deals, for better gossip, and often for each other. Historians still puzzle over the extent of romantic freedom available in public settings. Some say flirtation was confined to feast days and fairs. Others suggest the market was a kind of semi-permissible liminal space, a place where normal rules blurred slightly in the noise and chaos. One fringe record from the court rolls of Chester details a complaint lodged by a man who lost the attention of his betrothed to a flax merchant with finer shoes. The judge ruled that shoes were not grounds for annulment, but also advised the man to consider washing more frequently. Which says everything, really. You think of your own courtship. How many stolen glances it took. How many small jokes traded over baskets of leeks and carrots. How long it took before she let her hand rest on your sleeve without snatching it back. There's a rhythm to public affection. It must be quiet coated, a loaf shared, a shoulder brushed, a price argued down, just because she said she liked the color of that thread. These are the old world love languages, trade time and tiny defiance. At the market today, you'll pass stalls that remind you of early days, the tanner's wife who smuggled in foreign spices, the fishmonger who told you to stop gawping at your girl and pick a herring. The memories are still vivid even if the people have changed. You buy onions, not the spoiled ones, in a length of blue ribbon. Not because she asked, but because you know she hates the red one in her hair. And because she'll pretend not to care and then wear it for 3 weeks straight. When you return, the door creaks the same as always. She looks up from mending a tunic and raises an eyebrow. That better not be dried eel again. Not this time, you say, revealing the onions like a magician with a humble trick. And then like a second act, the ribbon. She says nothing, just looks at it, then tucks it into her sewing basket without a word. You sit beside her on the floor, shoulder to shoulder, as the rain finally begins to fall outside. You hear the steady patter on the thatch, the occasional drop hitting the window like a pebble. And in that moment, shared and silent, you know you did well today. No feast, no fanfare, just onions and ribbon, and the woman who makes even a rainy afternoon feel like a festival. Rain settles in like a guest who plans to stay. It taps the roof in rhythms you can almost follow like a lullaby with no words. The house grows dim shadows, stretching in corners while the hearth flickers with a quiet confidence. You and she move about the space like dancers long practiced in their steps, not speaking much, not needing to. This is what love becomes in the long years, a shared choreography. Who reaches for the pot, who stirs the broth, who remembers to salt it this time? No instructions, no praise, just the soft hum of knowing. In medieval households, this kind of affection was invisible to outsiders. There were no declarations, no grand gestures. But behind closed doors, or rather behind thin curtains and drafty shutters, it unfolded with remarkable consistency. Daily kindness, mutual reliance, little rituals repeated until they became sacred. Historians still debate how widespread such domestic tenderness really was. Some argue that peasant marriages were pragmatic at best, loveless at worst. Others insist that the emotional lives of the working class have simply been underdocumented. After all, who records the way two people sit close on a rainy afternoon, quietly sharing the last of the cheese? One fringe artifact found buried beneath a cottage hearthstone was a small wooden charm carved with 2 initials and a pair of crossed spoons. Archaeologists believe it marked the end of a shared meal or perhaps the beginning of one. Either way, it suggests something tender, something chosen. Today, as rain turns the yard into a shallow lake, and the children busy themselves with buttons and scraps of thread, you find yourself pausing not because there's work to be done, there always is, but because you notice her again. The way her hair is tucked behind one ear. The way she hums when mending just under her breath. The way she doesn't flinch when thunder rumbles, just stares out the window with that unbothered face you used to think was stern, but now understand as simply focused. You hand her a mug of warm ale and she takes it without looking. Just murmurs a thank you. No ceremony, no gratitude speech. But she shifts slightly to make room for you on the bench, and that's thanks enough, eh? You sit shoulder to shoulder, letting the rain speak for both of you. There's something deeply medieval about weather-bound days. With no shops to browse, no screens to scroll, no urgency to perform, just the hours slow and damp asking you to be present. To be content, to find comfort in closeness. And in that space, affection flourishes. You remember a story she once told you about an old couple who used to pretend the sound of thunder was angels bowling. Every storm they'd wager who would win by counting the rumbles. You asked if they were real. She shrugged. I hope so. In towns and villages, these little myths were love's currency. Shared jokes, shared fears, shared stories passed down like heirlooms wrapped in the laughter that only long familiarity allows. You take the last piece of bread. She slaps your hand, but only lightly, then hands it to you anyway. And just like that, the afternoon turns into evening. The room grows darker. The fire glows warmer. The storm outside becomes a lullaby. And inside, two people sit side by side saying nothing but meaning everything. The fire's burned low and the children are asleep, their limbs tangled in blankets and dreams. You step lightly over the floorboards, careful not to wake anyone with a misplaced creak. Behind you, she finishes tying up the last of the bundle's damp shoes cloaks by the hearth, the small sack of saved herbs hanging from its hook. It's the quiet part of the evening now, not quite night, not quite day's end. Just that soft edge between where voices drop and eyes linger longer. In medieval homes, this was the hour for whispers, for shared thoughts, for touching hands beneath the blanket and pretending the world beyond your door didn't exist. Because for this little while it didn't. The curfew bell had rung. The world was shut. The hearth was yours. Historians still discuss what intimacy meant after sundown. Was it duty? Was it desire? Was it both? Records are too sparse to say for sure, but the tone of folk songs, bedtime tales, and letters from the period suggest this truth. Nighttime was often when affection could be fully, finally honest. A fringe piece of evidence comes from a preserved note found behind a beam in a 14th century cottage. Scrawled in clumsy script, I love how she sighs when I braid her hair in the dark. The ink faded, the feeling intact. You sit now side by side on the edge of the bed. She's brushing her hair and you offer to help. She passes you the comb. It catches slightly on a knot. She winces. You murmur an apology. She leans into your hand. Moments like this need no language. Just gentleness. Just presence. Hair, after all, was considered a deeply intimate thing in the Middle Ages. Women often covered theirs in public, not just for modesty, but to keep something private sacred for home. To see your hair loose like this was to be trusted, and that trust, that's the most romantic thing of all. You finish combing and she lies back, arms tucked beneath her head. You lie beside her, not touching, yet just listening to her breath, to the wind, rattling the shutters to the last sigh of the fire. She says, "Do you think we'll dream the same dream you say?" "Only if it's a good one." She laughs, quiet and tired. Affection after a day's work wasn't about grand emotion. It was about being witnessed, being remembered, being safe beside someone who saw you covered in mud, flushed with temper, and still chose to share a bed with you anyway. There's an old proverb from Burgundy where bread is broken and bodies rest, love is fed. That's never sounded more true than now. You roll closer. She turns toward you. There's no rush, just rhythm. You might talk. You might not. You might fall asleep mid-sentence. But your hands will find each other, your breath will match. And when the rooster crows again, she'll still be there grumbling, half awake, passing you your boots. And love once more will be waiting by the door. Sleep doesn't come right away. Not because you're restless, quite the opposite. It's just that the stillness is so complete, so rare, that your mind decides to wander before it finally lets go. You lie there listening to the rhythm of her breathing, the pop of the last ember, the rain tapping like a soft drumbeat on the thatch. This is the hour of memory, when the body is still but the heart stirs gently through time. You think of the first winter you spent together huddled in a room with a cracked window and a blanket that barely covered your legs. How you both laughed when the candle blew out, then cried when the wind came in, then laughed again because it was either that or go mad. That year was hard, and so was the next, but you stayed. She stayed. And somehow that staying became your story. Historians still argue whether medieval couples measured time in seasons or in survival. The truth is probably both. There was no calendar hung on the wall, no anniversaries marked with cakes and candles. But there were markers all the same: the winter of the pox, the year the pig got out, the spring the twins were born. Time etched itself into your life through shared trials and triumphs. One fringe letter found folded into a spindle box in Wales begins, "To my wife, this is the 17th winter I have come home to your soup. That is all, and that is everything. No flourishes, no sonnet. Just the steady beat of constancy." That's the kind of love you feel now in this quiet moment. Not the kind that races, the kind that roots. You turn on your side watching the soft rise and fall of her breath. She's dreaming now, brows twitching, lips parted slightly. You hope it's a good dream? You hope you're in it. In medieval belief, dreams were often thought to carry meaning omens, portents messages from the divine. But among ordinary people, they were also simply shared curiosities. You'd wake, blink at the ceiling, and ask, were you running too? Was the bread singing again? And sometimes, just sometimes, your partner would say yes. You think of how many mornings began with that half-dreamed laughter, with her saying you talked in your sleep again, with you saying, "At least I didn't snore," and with both of you pretending not to remember the thunder or the aches or the howling wind. Love isn't a single flame. It's 1,000 tiny sparks, and many of them light when the world is at its quietest. You finally close your eyes. Let your breath match hers. Let the warmth of the bed and the sound of the storm pull you downward. In a world where nothing is guaranteed, not crops, not coin, not kings, it turns out that the most radical act is simply staying. And not just staying, but softening. Choosing to turn towards someone night after night and say with every breath I'm here, tomorrow will bring mud and mischief, chores and Chapman, and probably a hen where it shouldn't be. But tonight it's enough to lie here, to drift, to know that when you wake someone will still be within arm's reach. And that, more than any tapestry, any sermon, any courtly tale, is the richest treasure of them all. The morning arrives not with trumpets, but with aches. Your back protests, your knees mutter. You blink at the gray light filtering through the shutters and remember again that you are no longer 20. But she is already up. You hear her humming softly in the other room. The smell of something warm rising on the air. Oats maybe, or flatbread crisping on the pan. You swing your legs over the edge of the bed and sit there for a moment, rubbing your eyes. Then you smile. Not because of the song, not even because of the food, but because she's still humming. In medieval homes, mornings weren't sacred, they were survival. But in the quiet choreography of couples, there was comfort. Shared rituals made the cold bearable. The same cup, the same seat. The same rhythm of steps before the day scattered everyone to field market or forge. Historians still discuss whether mornings were more affectionate or more pragmatic in peasant life. But one thing is clear: every hour mattered. And the first hour before the world barged in was often where love settled its roots. A fringe detail from a 13th century inventory in northern France lists among the possessions of a deceased tanner one carved bowl of horn kept warm each morning by his wife's hand. No value assigned, no comment made, just a fact recorded and left to whisper through time. You dress quickly, tying your belt with clumsy fingers, and shuffle into the main room. She's stirring a pot back to you, hair pulled back with that same blue ribbon. The one from the market. The one she pretended not to care about. You say good morning. She glances over her shoulder. It will be once you fetch more wood. There's no kiss, no declaration, just this bread warmth obligation. And the sound of her voice in the house. You slip outside into the gray light, the air biting your cheeks awake. The rain has stopped, but the sky still droops low. The firewood stack is damp. You shake out the driest pieces and load your arms. As you return, you pause just for a moment to look at the house. Crooked roof. Smoke curling from the chimney. A cracked shutter still stubborn from last winter's storm. And inside her. This is love, you think. Not the palace kind. The hearth kind. The don't forget the eggs kind. The kind that sneaks up on you, not with flowers, but with familiarity. You push the door open. The pot hisses. She looks up, says nothing. But she's laid out 2 bowls. You sit and she fills them. Steam rises. You eat in silence broken only by the clink of spoon on wood. And halfway through, she slides a slice of bread from her plate to yours. Says, you missed dinner last night. You don't argue. You just take it. And that's the whole story of your life, really, 2 people, trading small mercies across a table that has seen everything. Hunger, laughter, tears, and the slow passing of years. You finish your meal. She gathers the bowls. You say thanks. She says you'll owe me later. And you both know you will. And you both know you'll pay it gladly. Because in a world full of hard things, blisters, frostbite, famine, there is nothing softer, nothing braver than this kind of love, shared quiet and daily renewed. The sun finally shows itself by mid-morning, a pale disk, peeking through mist as though even it is reluctant to commit. You're in the garden now, sleeves rolled, hands in soil. The potatoes need turning and the weeds are smug from all that rain. Beside you, she's gathering mint and nettle, muttering to herself about the cat who keeps knocking over her drying rack. You work in silence. Not the tense kind. The old kind. The kind earned over years of side-by-side labor where a glance can say more than a sentence. Your spade hits something hard a stone, probably, and you groan. She doesn't even look up. Dig from the side, she calls. You smirk. Of course she's right. In medieval life, much of affection played out through labor. Tasks weren't separate from love, they were its language. Building fences, stirring pots, hauling water, sewing seams. Each gesture carried its own quiet meaning. I see you. I know what you need. Let me help. Historians still argue how medieval gender roles shaped or constrained emotional connection. There's plenty of evidence for inequality, especially in law. But in daily life, especially among the working poor, partnerships were often forged in cooperation. If you didn't help one another, you didn't eat. One fringe example appears in the will of a 15th century farmer in Sussex, who left his best cloak and sharpening stone to my good wife Joan, who bore with my temper and fixed my boots. Not romantic poetry, perhaps, but in a world of scarcity that sharpening stone might as well be roses. You glance over at her again. She's not looking. She's counting leaves, lips moving silently. Years ago, you wouldn't have noticed that look on her face, the one she gets when she's trying to remember something from her mother's herbal lore. Now you know it by heart. You dig. she gathers, a small rhythm between bigger ones. At some point she says, "You're bleeding. You look small nick on your thumb." She sets her basket down, walks over, rips a strip from her apron hem, and binds your hand without comment. You watch her fingers, quick, sure, familiar. She doesn't scold, doesn't fuss. Just ties the knot tight, but not too tight. "There," she says, brushing her hands. "Try not to fall apart before supper." You grin. "I'll do my best. Back to work." The sun climbs higher, bees drone. Somewhere nearby a neighbor shouts at a goose and the goose wins. And all the while the two of you tend the earth and each other in the same breath. In a world where emotions were often hidden beneath layers of duty, it's these gestures, brief, practical, tender, that kept love alive. She finishes her picking. You finish your digging. Together you walk back toward the house baskets full of mint and roots and one slightly bruised thumb. She bumps your shoulder as you walk. You bump her back. No one writes songs about this kind of romance. No bard sits in the tavern and sings. She noticed my cut and bound it with cloth older than our marriage. But maybe they should, because this is what real love looked like for most people in medieval times. And maybe for most people now. The afternoon light slants golden through the window dust, dancing like lazy spirits in the air. You're inside again. Now the basket's emptied herbs hung to dry and your thumb wrapped neatly through already stained from the garden. She's working at the table mending a shirt, so worn it probably qualifies as parchment. You're sorting flax for tomorrow's trip to the mill. There's no music, but there's rhythm. No conversation, but plenty being said. In medieval households, afternoons like this were some of the few moments of pause. Between morning labor and evening prep, there existed a sliver of time that was neither survival nor ceremony. It was simply being together. Historians still argue whether this kind of companionable silence was considered valuable or merely practical. Did people cherish it or just accept it? And the truth is, for many couples, it became a kind of prayer, not with words, with presence. One fringe account from a Danish household ledger includes the phrase, "In this hour she sits, and I sit near," and that is enough. Scribbled in a margin perhaps never meant to be read, and yet here it is 8 centuries later still making hearts ache. She looks up from the shirt. "You're not sorting," she says. "I'm admiring," you reply. "Save your poetry. I want this shirt wearable by Michaelmas." You smile. It's not poetry, just accurate observation. Then accurately observe that you're not helping. You grab the next bundle of flax and set to work, but every now and then you glance up. She pretends not to notice. She's good at that, has had years of practice. You think back to when you first lived together, the awkwardness, the negotiations over how to stack firewood, how to salt meat, how to share space when privacy was a luxury, and how slowly the friction wore down into form, like river stones. There's a kind of love that isn't about discovery, but about durability. You find a knot in the flax. She notices, slides the knife across the table without looking. You cut it free, thanks. She nods. Doesn't look up. The light shifts again. Evening approaches. Somewhere you hear a church bell tolling the hour. Its echo is long, slow, worn, like the town itself. You think of all the couples across the village, across the countryside, across time itself, performing these same rituals in different dialects, different houses under different roofs. Hands brushing against hands, eyes meeting briefly over bread or thread or water buckets. No grand statements, just enduring, just showing up, just doing the work of love in a world that rarely wrote it down. You finish the last bundle. She finishes the last stitch. You both sit for a moment, neither moving. letting the stillness settle like a shawl. Then she says, "There's stew. If you want it." You say, "I do." She smiles without looking. Good answer. You rise, stretch your back, and join her in the kitchen, where the pot simmers and the scent of thyme and marrow root fill the room. And as the sun dips lower, casting fire across the walls, you sit down together once more. Not for ceremony, not for festivity, just because you always have. Evening unfolds slowly now, like a blanket being drawn over a sleeping village. The stew is long gone. The bowls are cleaned and turned upside down to dry. The children finally are put to bed after 3 false alarms about monsters, 2 songs, and 1 dramatic retelling of how someone stubbed their toe last week. The house hums in quiet again. You're both tired, but not yet ready to sleep. There's still 1 candle left its flame, dancing in the draft, casting long shadows on the walls. You're sitting near the hearth. She's beside you, legs tucked beneath her mending basket, finally closed. For once, you both sit without tasks. Just 2 people in a quiet room. In the Middle Ages, this was rare. Stillness like firewood was a luxury, but when it came, it was often more intimate than anything else the day had offered. This was the hour of slow conversations, of private jokes, repeated for the 100th time, of fingers brushing by accident, and then staying close on purpose. Historians still debate whether intimacy in medieval marriages improved over time, or simply adjusted to necessity. Did people grow fonder through hardship, or just more dependent? The answer likely is both, and tonight you feel a little of each. One fringe example from a 14th century household diary in Tuscany describes a husband who carved a new stool for his wife each year, not because they broke, but because she changes how she sits when she's happiest. A strange gesture, perhaps. But what is love if not the memorizing of someone's tiniest habits? She leans her head against your shoulder now. No words. Just wait. Trust. You place your hand over hers. It's rough familiar. The hand that's pulled children from mud-stirred pots, sewn hems, and waved off your worst ideas. It rests there now, quiet as a vow. You remember when we met, you asked just to hear her voice. "I remember your hat," she says. You laugh. It was fashionable. It looked like a soggy mushroom. It kept my ears warm. Shame it didn't help the rest of your brain. You both chuckle softly like a shared secret. In that laughter is everything that's lasted, the quarrels that turned into stories, the mistakes that turned into memories, the years that somehow blurred into this moment. She shifts closer. Outside, the world is dark. Wolves may howl, roofs may leak, kings may rise and fall. But in this room, in this flickering light, 2 people rest against one another. And the centuries between them and the future are filled not with legends, but with evenings exactly like this, unwritten, unremarkable, unforgettable. You kiss the top of her head. She sighs, and for a long time you both say nothing, because sometimes love's final word is simply staying near. Outside, the wind has stilled. The sky is a deep, velvety black, pin-pricked with stars that peek between clouds like shy children. The fire is nearly out now, just a few glowing coals curled into themselves, sighing softly with each breath of night air that slips through the shutter. You and she are still there on the bench. Bodies relaxed in that heavy, comforting silence that comes only after a long day well lived. She rests her head against your shoulder again, this time with full weight. Her ribbon has slipped askew and a wisp of hair brushes your cheek. You don't move it, you just breathe it in smoke herbs, something vaguely sweet. The scent of home. In this hour, the world feels older, slower, softer, the kind of hour where time doesn't tick, it exhales. In medieval life, these were the moments people rarely wrote about, the gaps between candle and cot, the pauses in conversation that weren't awkward but sacred, when nothing needed to be said because everything worth saying was already known. Historians still puzzle over the emotional interior lives of medieval couples. So much was left unwritten, unwitnessed, but once in a while you catch a glimpse of a scrawled line in the margin of a prayer book, a worn patch on a cloak stitched with extra care, a family seal pressed into wax and tucked into a letter with no words. One fringe artifact, kept in a tiny glass case in a Czech monastery, is a comb, carved with 2 names in a single sentence. She laughed in her sleep, and I stayed awake to hear it again. No date, no backstory, but everything you need to know is there. You look down at her now. She's dozing, breath slow and shallow, one hand still lightly touching yours even in sleep. You don't move. These are the moments you'll remember most clearly. Not the births or the funerals or the market days, but this her warmth beside you, the hush of the house, the feeling that somehow against all odds you've made something enduring. You think of the younger version of her, the girl who called your best tunic a cabbage sack, who once dared you to steal honey and then let you take the blame. The one who braided your hair during a thunderstorm because she said you looked too serious. That girl is still here. And so are you. There's something quietly miraculous about that. The candle gutters once, twice, then goes out. You don't light another. You shift gently, sliding your arm around her, guiding both of you toward the bed with the practiced ease of decades. She murmurs something unintelligible and curls into your side as you lie down. The blanket is thin, but the warmth between you is enough. You stare up at the wooden beams overhead, counting familiar cracks. Somewhere outside an owl calls. And in this moment, in this medieval house, in this old bed, in this quiet life, you feel the full weight of what you've built. Not a castle, not a legend, but something stronger than either. A love that endured. The night is deep now, so still you can hear the soft shift of her breath beside you, and the occasional creak of timber settling into sleep. The world outside feels impossibly far away. The wind has calmed. Even the chickens who always seem to cluck at shadows are silent. It is as if the entire village has exhaled together. You lie there, eyes closed, not yet asleep. Her hand rests gently on your chest, fingers curled, just so as if they too are tired of the day's work. You don't dare move. There's a peace to this moment that can't be summoned. It can only be earned through years of waking early, of returning late, of mending and digging and forgiving the same flaws 100 times. This is what intimacy really looks like after a lifetime together, not fire, but embers. Not wine, but warm broth. Not a love that dazzles, but one that endures quietly in the small space between 2 hearts that have chosen to remain. Historians still search for evidence of enduring affection in medieval marriages. The documents are dry tax records, legal disputes, inventories. But between the lines, you sometimes glimpse a moment like this. A man who left my best boots to the one who always dried them? Or a woman who asked to be buried with the wooden spoon her husband carved? And then there are the fringe accounts, half legends, half truths, like the story of the old couple in York who were said to walk the same path to church each day for 60 years. No one remembers their names. But the path is still called Lover's Lane. You shift slightly enough to tuck the blanket higher over her shoulder. She murmurs, then quiets again. You feel the warmth of her breath against your neck. You think of the first time she laughed at your joke. The first time she let you braid her hair. The first time she let you see her cry. Each memory arrives not with clarity, but softness, like fog, like a dream just out of reach. And yet their weight is real. They have built something solid, something stronger than history books and older than kings. You open your eyes one last time. The moonlight has found its way through a crack in the shutter. It lands across her face gentle as a blessing. And you think this is love in its final form. No more questions, no more doubts. Just the slow, steady knowing that you were here and she was here too. And that was enough. So now, as the night settles completely and your breath begins to slow, let this story stay with you, not as history written in books, but as warmth felt in bone. Let the creak of the wooden floors, the scent of herbs on the hearth, the soft rustle of linen sheets drift across your thoughts like the final notes of a lullaby. Let the image of two hands worn but entwined remind you that love doesn't always shout, it often whispers. It lives in the smallest gestures repeated day after day until they become sacred. You don't need castles to feel safe. You don't need poetry to feel seen. Sometimes what you need most is just the presence of another heartbeat, steady beside your own. As you drift now, picture that flickering candlelight fading into soft gray. Picture that bed tucked under sloped beams. Picture the world hushed outside and hold on to that gentle truth. Love, even in a time of hardship and haystacks, could be soft, could be strong, could be yours. Let sleep take you gently. You are warm. You are home. You are not alone. And in the quiet that follows, know this: the story has ended, but its comfort remains. End of script. Sweet dreams.